When you find yourself in situations where you keep explaining your choices, your words, or even your silence, what you may not realize is that you're slowly draining the confidence out of your presence. Over-explaining is often born out of the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of someone thinking less of you, or the fear that your decision isn't good enough on its own. The truth is, when you constantly add extra layers of justification, you're unintentionally signaling that you don't fully stand behind yourself. Instead of projecting certainty, you project doubt, and people naturally take cues from the energy you give off. If you don't sound convinced about you, it makes it easier for someone else not to be convinced either. Think about the subtle ways this shows up. You say no to an invitation, but then immediately add a long explanation about being tired, busy, or dealing with something else, as if your no on its own isn't valid enough. You give your opinion on something, but then you backtrack, soften it, or overfill it with reasons just to make sure no one disagrees with you. You share a boundary, but then you cushion it with 10 apologies to make sure you don't come across as too harsh. What happens here is that you take a strong stance and then water it down until it loses its power. It's not the explanation itself that's the issue. It's the excess, the overload that makes it look like you're trying too hard to defend yourself. When you over-explain, you also give away your emotional leverage. People begin to see that they can push you into clarifying more, into defending more, into talking yourself into circles just to keep their approval. That habit puts the control of the interaction into their hands instead of yours. Someone confident doesn't feel the need to justify every little choice because they trust their judgment and let their actions speak. The more you explain, the more it suggests you're afraid of silence, and silence is often where true confidence sits. Confidence doesn't rush to fill gaps, it allows things to be said once and then rests. It's also important to notice how over-explaining affects the way someone values you. When a man sees that you cannot stand by your words without leaning on piles of justifications, it can come across as if you're asking him to decide if you're worthy. It creates an imbalance where his perception of you starts to feel like the deciding factor instead of your own groundedness. The more you feed into that pattern, the more he starts to assume that your decisions are negotiable, that your boundaries are flexible, and that your confidence is conditional. That weakens the respect he feels for you, not because of what you said, but because of how you keep saying it. Breaking out of this doesn't mean becoming cold or refusing to ever explain anything. It means becoming mindful of when your explanation crosses into justification. It means noticing when you're adding words out of insecurity instead of clarity. Sometimes a simple answer is the most powerful one. Sometimes saying less allows the weight of your words to carry more strength. If you can train yourself to resist the urge to always defend, you create space for your presence to carry the authority that over-explaining usually strips away. And the more you practice this, the more you'll notice how freeing it feels. You won't need to convince anyone to see your value because your value will be communicated in your certainty. The pauses, the stillness, and the confidence in short answers start to become louder than any long-winded explanation ever could. You'll begin to see that people lean in more when you stop over-explaining, that your words carry more respect when they're not weighed down with excess, and that your own trust in yourself becomes the thing that commands attention without you having to work so hard for it. When you ignore your own boundaries, you send a silent message that your comfort and your limits are negotiable. At first, it might seem small, agreeing to something you didn't want to do, letting a comment slide that bothered you, saying yes when you were exhausted. But over time, these small acts add up to a much bigger story, a story that tells others you don't value yourself enough to protect your own space. The danger in this pattern is that once you teach someone your boundaries don't really matter, they start to believe it too. And when they believe it, the respect they have for you slowly begins to fade. Boundaries are not about being rigid or shutting people out. They are about teaching others how to treat you. Every time you say yes out of guilt, fear, or desperation to please, you're trading your self-respect for short-term comfort. The more you give away your no, the more you dilute the power of your yes. A man pays attention to that, even subconsciously. He notices whether you stick to what you say, whether you can protect your time and energy, and whether you carry yourself with the strength of someone who knows their worth. When you let things slide repeatedly, he doesn't have to guess your value. You've already shown him that you're willing to lower it. Ignoring boundaries doesn't always happen loudly. Most often, it happens quietly, through small compromises. You might let someone's inconsiderate behavior slide because you don't want to seem dramatic. You might accept last-minute changes, even though they leave you inconvenienced. You might let your feelings get dismissed because you don't want to argue. On the surface, these seem harmless, but each time it happens, you chip away at your own sense of importance. You create a dynamic where his comfort is prioritized over your dignity, and once that balance tips too far, it becomes difficult to regain the respect that was lost. There's also a deeper effect here. When you consistently ignore your boundaries, you start to lose trust in yourself. You begin to feel resentful, not just toward the other person, but toward yourself for not speaking up. That resentment shows up in your energy, in the way you interact, and in how you carry yourself. You may find yourself overthinking, overanalyzing, or silently blaming, all because you avoided the simple act of honoring your own line. And a man can sense that, even if you don't say a word. He picks up on the unease, the frustration, and the lack of conviction, and it shifts the way he sees you. The strongest form of value you can communicate is the ability to say no with calmness and clarity. A no that doesn't come with guilt, panic, or over-explaining is one of the clearest signals of self-respect. It shows that you understand your worth and that you don't need someone else's validation to protect it. The right kind of man will see that as attractive because it shows you are not afraid to walk away from what doesn't serve you. The wrong kind of man will test those boundaries, but your consistency in holding them will decide whether he rises to meet your standards or fades out of your life. Every time you choose to honor your boundaries, you reinforce your own value. It might feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you've been used to pleasing others, but the shift it creates is powerful. You no longer operate from a place of fear of losing someone. Instead, you operate from a place of certainty that the right people will stay when they respect you. And when a man sees that you do not bend on the things that matter to you, he begins to view you with a deeper sense of respect, a respect that grows not because you demanded it, but because you lived it. When you find yourself competing for his attention, you step into a game that you were never meant to play. Attention is not something you should have to chase or wrestle for, because the moment you do, you send a signal that his focus defines your worth. The subtle ways this shows up can look like overtexting, trying too hard to look impressive, or constantly checking in to make sure he's interested. Instead of allowing space for him to naturally invest in you, you fill the silence with effort that ends up making you appear more desperate than desirable. A man can feel when someone is working overtime to keep his eyes on them, and instead of pulling him closer, it often creates the opposite effect. The need to compete for attention usually comes from fear of being overlooked, replaced, or forgotten. When that fear takes control, it pushes you into behaviors that are not authentic to who you are. You start adjusting yourself based on what you think will keep him interested, and little by little, you lose the ease and confidence that made you attractive in the first place. It's inauthenticity disguised as effort, and while it may keep his attention for a moment, it never holds it long term. Real presence is felt when you are comfortable being yourself, not when you are fighting to be seen. Another way this competition shows up is when you measure yourself against others, either openly or silently. You might notice how he looks at other women or how much time he spends with friends, and instead of standing firm in your own value, you start trying to outperform them. This competition is exhausting because it pulls you out of your own lane. You begin to see love and connection as something you have to earn rather than something that should flow naturally. The more you compete, the more you abandon the peace of knowing that the right attention doesn't need to be fought for. It's freely given. Men can sense when someone is competing for their validation. It shows up in constant questions, in exaggerated displays of interest, or in an anxious energy that hovers around every interaction. Instead of seeing you as grounded, he begins to see you as insecure, because every action signals that his attention is a prize you desperately need to win. The irony is that the more you fight for it, the less valuable it becomes, because true value never begs. True value doesn't need to be louder or shinier. It simply is, and it's felt through confidence, calmness, and self-assurance. Letting go of the competition means learning to trust that your presence is enough. It's about understanding that if he needs to be constantly chased, then his attention was never secure to begin with. When you pull back from the chase, you allow room for him to step forward, to invest, to prove his interest. You don't crowd the space with noise and effort. You allow silence and stillness to test whether he values you enough to move toward you. That shift changes everything because it communicates a quiet confidence that cannot be ignored. When you no longer fight for attention, you regain your own power. You stop letting his response dictate your actions and instead operate from a place of choice. If he values you, his actions will show it, and you won't have to compete to see it. If he doesn't, your energy is preserved for someone who will meet you with the effort you deserve. Competing for attention drains your presence, but standing firm in your value amplifies it. And in the end, it's the refusal to compete that makes you unforgettable, because it shows that your worth is not up for negotiation. When you lack emotional control, even the smallest things can start to overshadow the way you are perceived. A raised voice over a minor issue, a dramatic reaction to a delayed message, or a burst of frustration over something trivial may feel justified in the moment, but they send a clear signal that your emotions are running you instead of you running them. People pay attention to how you handle pressure, and when a man sees that every little bump in the road shakes your composure, it makes you appear unstable rather than strong. Emotional control isn't about never feeling upset. It's about learning how to channel those feelings in a way that doesn't erode respect. Losing control too often can turn small disagreements into unnecessary battles. When emotions take over, the focus shifts from finding solutions to proving points, and that dynamic quickly wears down the connection. A man doesn't remember just the words you say in heated moments. He remembers the energy behind them, the anger, the intensity, the unpredictability. Over time, this creates a tension where he feels he has to walk on eggshells, never knowing what small thing might spark a big reaction. That constant tension makes respect difficult to sustain, and without respect, value begins to fade. Another way lack of control shows up is in overanalyzing and overreacting to situations that don't require it. A missed call turns into a sign of rejection, a delayed reply becomes proof of disinterest, and a casual comment is taken as an insult. These patterns of reaction are exhausting not only for you, but also for the person on the receiving end. Instead of bringing calm and steadiness into the connection, it introduces chaos and insecurity. A man can admire beauty, intelligence, and charm, but if he constantly feels that peace is missing, admiration eventually gets replaced with avoidance. Emotional steadiness, on the other hand, communicates maturity and confidence. When you can respond rather than react, it shows that you trust yourself enough not to be thrown off balance by every small wave. That calmness becomes magnetic because it creates a safe space around you. Men respect women who know how to regulate their emotions because it demonstrates strength without the need for control over anyone else. It's not about suppressing what you feel, it's about choosing how to express it so that your feelings are heard without being overshadowed by drama. It's also worth noticing how emotional control ties into self-respect. If you constantly let your emotions dictate your actions, you end up apologizing afterward for things you didn't mean or behaviors that didn't reflect who you truly are. That cycle chips away at your own confidence, leaving you feeling guilty and drained. But when you pause, breathe, and respond with clarity, you reinforce your own sense of dignity. You show that you respect yourself enough not to let temporary feelings create permanent damage. That self-control is not only attractive, but also deeply grounding for both you and anyone connected to you. Mastering your emotions doesn't mean being robotic or pretending you don't care. It means having the strength to feel deeply without letting those feelings spill into destructive behaviors. It means being able to handle disappointment, conflict, or uncertainty without losing the steadiness that makes you valuable. A man will always remember how he feels when he is around you, and if what he feels is peace, strength, and stability, he won't take that lightly. Emotional control becomes the quiet power that speaks louder than any dramatic reaction ever could, and it is that power that keeps your value intact in his eyes. When you dim your own light, you teach others to overlook you. This often happens quietly in moments where you minimize your accomplishments, brush off compliments, or pretend to be less capable than you really are just to make someone else feel comfortable. You think you're being humble, but what you're actually doing is shrinking yourself in a way that hides your value. A man notices when you downplay your strengths, and instead of seeing confidence, he sees uncertainty. Over time, this pattern makes it easy for him to take you for granted because you're not showing him the full power of who you are. It often begins with good intentions. You don't want to intimidate, you don't want to come across as arrogant, or you're afraid that your success or intelligence might make him feel small. So you soften your edges, you hold back your opinions, and you give less of yourself than you're capable of giving. But in trying to protect his comfort, you sacrifice your own authenticity. The result is that you're no longer presenting the real you, but a smaller version that you think is easier for him to accept. That smaller version is not where your true value lives. There's also a deeper message that gets sent when you dim your light, that you don't believe your brightness is worth standing in. Men respect what you respect, and if you constantly signal that your talents, your voice, or your uniqueness aren't worth showing, he will eventually start to see them the same way. Instead of celebrating you, he learns to overlook you. Instead of rising to meet your strength, he begins to treat you as though you are weaker than you really are. You may not say it out loud, but your behavior tells the story that you believe you need to hide in order to be loved. Dimming yourself also affects the energy you bring into a relationship. When you constantly suppress parts of who you are, you create an invisible tension between what you feel and what you express. That tension can be sensed even if it's not spoken. A man can feel when you're holding back, and it changes the dynamic from one of authenticity to one of performance. Relationships built on performance are never stable because you're always editing yourself instead of showing up fully. The most magnetic presence is one that is unafraid to shine without apology. The irony is that many women dim their light thinking it will keep a man, but it often has the opposite effect. What initially draws him in is your energy, your brilliance, your confidence, and your passion. When you begin to mute those qualities, you strip away the very things that made you stand out. Over time, he stops feeling the spark that attracted him in the first place, not because it disappeared, but because you buried it under layers of fear and self-doubt. In trying to protect the connection, you end up weakening it. Choosing not to dim your light is not about arrogance. It's about honesty. It's about being willing to take up the space that is already yours, to speak your truth without shrinking, and to let your strengths be seen without apology. When a man sees that you refuse to downplay who you are, he recognizes that your value is non-negotiable. He understands that your light is not something you switch off for anyone's comfort, and that realization commands respect in a way that no amount of playing small ever could or